Pizzaverse Studios presents Tony Bum Pizza, the discount hitman. The only guy who misses more shots than he takes. You need someone handled? You need a situation taken care of? You need a guy who'll talk about whacking people online like he's still in witness protection? Then boy, do we got the clown for you. Tony Bum Pizza, fake hitman services. Wax starting at $29.99. Plus tax, plus gas, plus bridge tolls, plus I forgot my wallet fees. Guaranteed to miss every target. Apologize halfway through and ask for donations. Blame the feds, his ex, and the Illuminati. Brings his 2001 Mercedes as the getaway car. Breaks down every 6 blocks, dog hair included. Nobody's safer than the guy Tony's trying to kill. Former target, completely unharmed. Tony's code of honor. If you pay me cash up front, I'll definitely think about maybe doing it tomorrow. Limited time deal. Hire Tony for 2 jobs. Get 1 accidental confession on Facebook live free. Call now. 1-800-FAKE-WISE-GUY. Operators standing by, laughing. Tony Bum Pizza. He'll scare you with how incompetent he is. Sharon Tate, CieloDrive, the Cosa Nostra, and the Cover-Up. A Pizzaverse Studios documentary. A Palermo Productions original. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent D. Prio. For over half a century, the world has swallowed a perfect lie. The actress Sharon Tate was murdered by the fanatical Manson cult. But the real darkness at CieloDrive was far more brutal. It wasn't a cult crime, but a bloody purge orchestrated by the Cosa Nostra gang. When millions of dollars in drug money vanished, the top brass issued the death penalty. Charles Manson wasn't a psychologically manipulative cult leader. He was just a cheap mercenary thrown in as a pawn to create a false crime scene. Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, died unjustly as a scapegoat in Hollywood's dirtiest underworld war. And most shocking of all, the Los Angeles police knew the truth, but they chose to compromise and cover it all up. The cruelty of this orchestrated cover-up is rooted in the absolute innocence of its most famous victim. Before her legacy was hijacked by a fabricated myth, she was simply a woman building a life. Sharon Tate was building a life. Sharon Marie Tate was born on January 24, 1943. She grew up as a military child, moving from base to base, learning early how to adapt to new surroundings. By the late 60s, she was a highly sought-after actress, quickly solidifying her place in the studio system. In the summer of 1969, she was 26 years old and 8 months pregnant with Roman Polanski's child. She was preparing for motherhood, focused on her future, and entirely unaware of the illicit activities allegedly connected to her social circle. Los Angeles was a narcotic frontier. Los Angeles at the end of the 1960s was not just a city of peace, love, and celluloid dreams. It was a multi-million-dollar narcotic frontier. The East Coast crime families, specifically the Cosa Nostra, were expanding their operations westward. Cocaine was becoming the currency of the elite. It fueled the marathon film shoots, the endless canyon parties, and the manic energy of studio executives. But the mafia faced a strict logistical barrier. You cannot send a hardened street-level enforcer in a cheap suit up the winding, exclusive roads of Benedict Canyon. The Beverly Hills police would stop them immediately. Studio security would block them at the gates. The mob needed a sophisticated infiltration method. They needed a Trojan horse. They needed someone who naturally belonged in those opulent bedrooms and backstage dressing rooms. Someone who could carry a bag of contraband past any security guard without raising a single eyebrow. J. Sebring. They found their perfect mule in a man named J. Sebring. The public knew J. Sebring as a pioneer. He was the celebrity hairstylist who revolutionized men's grooming. He cut hair for Frank Sinatra, Steve McQueen, and Bruce Lee. He charged exorbitant fees and created a cult of personality around his shears. He was a staple of the Hollywood elite, driving sports cars and attending the most exclusive parties. But haircuts and hairspray do not entirely account for the vast sums of cash flowing through Sebring's life. Independent investigators and deep-dive crime researchers have long pointed to Sebring's secondary, far more dangerous profession. Alternative investigations allege Sebring operated as a premier cocaine distributor for organized crime in Los Angeles. His legitimate profession provided the ultimate cover. Sebring traveled with black leather kits filled with scissors, combs, and hair products. Those same kits were allegedly used to transport kilos of pure, uncut cocaine supplied by the New York crime families. Sebring had supreme access. He was a trusted confidant. When he walked into a movie star's private estate, he was welcomed with open arms. Alternative theories suggest the Cosa Nostra hierarchy strategically exploited this specific proximity. The capos back east recognized that Sebring's enduring relationship with an A-list actress provided the ultimate camouflage for La Cosa Nostra logistics. Tate's pristine public image inadvertently functioned as a high-value shield for the syndicate's West Coast operations. The bosses controlling the Cosa Nostra narcotics pipeline strictly viewed her presence as a tactical advantage, granting their distributor free movement among the wealthiest targets. He brought gossip, he brought style, and he brought the drugs that kept Hollywood running. He was the vital, trusted link between the gritty, violent underworld and the glittering upper class. This alleged dual life required immense psychological compartmentalization from Sebring. Alternative investigations suggest he was not merely an independent contractor, but a subordinate reporting directly to high-ranking capos who viewed him strictly as an earning asset. He had to constantly balance the delicate, unpredictable egos of A-list celebrities with the ruthless, zero-tolerance demands of his East Coast suppliers. In this shadow hierarchy, his celebrity status offered absolutely zero protection. To the bosses, a Hollywood pioneer was just another associate expected to kick up his weekly percentage without fail. The house on CieloDrive. Sharon Tate and J. Sebring shared a complex history. They had been lovers before Tate married Polanski. Despite the breakup, Sebring remained a constant, fiercely loyal fixture in her life. He was her protector, her confidant, and her closest friend. When Polanski traveled to Europe for film work in the summer of 1969, Sebring spent nearly every day at the CieloDrive house to ensure Sharon was not lonely. This loyalty placed Sharon directly in the crosshairs of a war she did not even know existed. The isolated mansion at 1050 CieloDrive was secluded and secure. For Tate, it was a sanctuary intended for a nursery. But for a man moving large quantities of illegal narcotics, it was an ideal drop site, away from the prying eyes of the Los Angeles Police Department. Sebring was using the proximity to Sharon Tate as a shield. This geographical overlap highlights the extreme asymmetry of the situation. What was a home to an expectant mother was allegedly designated on a Cosa Nostra ledger as a compromised distribution hub. The audit. The summer of 1969 was a boiling point. The drug network was hemorrhaging money. Significant shipments of mafia product had allegedly gone missing in Los Angeles. The bosses in New York were losing patience. When millions of dollars vanished from the underworld economy, someone has to pay. The mob began an audit of their West Coast operations. They looked at the supply lines. They looked at the distributors. They looked at Jay Sebring. Sebring was in deep trouble. Whether he had skimmed the money himself, whether he had been robbed by rival dealers, or whether he had simply lost control of his wealthy, erratic clientele, the result was the same. He was holding a debt he could not pay. He was a marked man. The mafia does not send collection letters. They send contractors. But a hit of this magnitude required careful planning. The mob could not simply walk into a Hollywood mansion, shoot a celebrity hairstylist, and walk away. The police response would be massive. The federal authorities would swoop in. The investigation would inevitably trace the drugs back to the distributors, and the distributors back to the East Coast families. The entire multi-million-dollar California drug pipeline would collapse. They needed the debt settled, but they needed the heat directed elsewhere. They needed a patsy. They needed someone loud, chaotic, and expendable. They found Charles Manson. Charles Manson as a pawn. Manson was not a mystical guru. He was a lifelong, institutionalized criminal trying to carve out a piece of the drug trade. He was a bottom feeder. He interacted with the Hollywood elite by supplying them with young girls and cheap hallucinogens. He wanted to be a rock star, but he possessed no actual talent. He was angry, bitter, and highly susceptible to leverage. The mob recognized a perfect tool. They could use Manson's bizarre commune as the ultimate weapon. They could hire him to perform the execution, and then they could frame the entire event as a psychotic counterculture rampage. The contract was issued. The target was Jay Sebring. The location was CieloDrive. The directive was simple. Kill the target. Kill anyone else in the house to eliminate witnesses and make it look like the work of insane fanatics. The mandate from the top was characterized by its absolute bureaucratic indifference. The Cosa Nostra bosses did not issue a specific order to murder Sharon Tate. To the leaders of the Italian-American mafia, she did not possess an identity or a cinematic legacy. She was simply classified under the umbrella of collateral damage. The operational directive dictated that the site had to be sanitized completely to protect the multi-million-dollar Cosa Nostra supply chain. The erasure of her life was fundamentally a corporate decision executed by proxies for the mob. The final day. Sharon Tate spent her final day alive complaining about the summer heat. She rested. She had lunch with friends. She talked about the baby kicking. She moved through the sprawling house completely unaware that a mafia kill squad was finalizing their preparations just miles away. The contrast between these final hours is staggering. While an expectant mother focused entirely on the imminent arrival of new life, high-level Cosa Nostra operators were clinically finalizing the logistics of a localized liquidation. Tate was resting in a meticulously decorated home, while seasoned handlers allegedly briefed disposable hitmen on how to secure any hidden narcotics belonging to the Italian mafia. These two entirely incompatible realities were on a direct collision course, orchestrated by men safely entrenched in the Cosa Nostra hierarchy. She was an innocent woman sitting on top of a powder keg. The clock was ticking down. The debt had come due, and the collectors were already on their way up the canyon road. The strike team. 150 CieloDrive was an isolated ranch-style house at the end of a private road. For the occupants, it was a secluded sanctuary. But for the syndicates tracking missing funds, alternative theories suggest this specific address was classified as a compromised distribution hub and a severe operational liability. The clock had run out on J. Sebring. The debt had to be settled. Charles Manson did not lead the strike team. He stayed behind. He dispatched his most capable, ruthless lieutenant. Charles Tex Watson was a desperate man tangled in the drug trade, a failed student turned petty criminal. He was accompanied by Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. The official narrative paints these four as mindless zombies high on LSD, wandering into the hills to start a race war. The tactical reality tells a completely different story. Zombies do not carry bolt cutters. Acid casualties do not know how to isolate a target. Watson parked the car at the bottom of the hill. He walked up to the gate. He climbed a telephone pole and severed the communication wires leading to the house. This was a deliberate, calculated action. It was a standard procedure for a professional home invasion. You cut the phones to trap the targets. You cut the phones to delay the police response. The hit squad was securing the perimeter. They were operating with military precision. Stephen Parent. A complication arose immediately. 18-year-old Stephen Parent was leaving the property in his car. He had been visiting the caretaker in the guest house. He was in the wrong place at the worst possible time. Watson did not hesitate. He lunged at the car. He slashed Parent with a knife and then shot him 4 times at point-blank range. There was no ritual. There was no hesitation. It was the cold, rapid elimination of a witness. The mandate from the mafia was clear. Leave no one alive. The devil's business. Inside the main house, the victims were entirely unaware of the violence unfolding in the driveway. Abigail Folger was reading a book in her bedroom. Wojciech Frykowski was asleep on the living room couch. Jay Sebring was in the master bedroom talking quietly with Sharon Tate. Watson cut the screen of a window. He climbed into the living room. He woke Frykowski. Frykowski looked up groggy and confused and saw a man standing over him with a revolver. He asked Watson who he was and what he was doing there. Watson delivered a line that would become the cornerstone of the cult myth. He said he was the devil and he was there to do the devil's business. It was a theatrical line. It was a script. The mob handlers had likely coached Manson, and Manson had coached Watson. They needed the killers to sound crazy. They needed witnesses, if any survived, to report the rantings of a lunatic. It was the first layer of the false flag operation. Watson was a hitman playing a role. Jay Sebring was the target. The squad rounded up the occupants. They forced Tate, Sebring, and Folger into the living room. The true nature of the intrusion became immediately apparent. This was not a robbery. They did not demand jewelry. They did not ransack the house for cash. Watson had brought a rope. You do not bring a 13-meter nylon rope to a burglary. You bring a rope to perform an execution. Watson focused his attention entirely on Jay Sebring. Sebring was the target. He was the distributor who had lost the product or the money. He was the man who owed the mafia. When Sebring protested the rough treatment of the pregnant Tate, Watson did not simply tell him to be quiet. He shot Sebring in the torso. Sebring collapsed to the floor. Watson walked over to him and kicked him viciously in the face multiple times. He shattered Sebring's nose and orbital bones. He then took a knife and stabbed Sebring 7 times. This was not a random act of violence. It was overkill. In the language of the Cosa Nostra, overkill is a message. It is a loud, bloody broadcast to the rest of the criminal network. The sheer brutality directed at Sebring was a punishment for betrayal. The rope. Watson took the nylon rope. He tied it around Sebring's neck. He slung the rope over the exposed wooden beams of the living room ceiling. He then tied the other end around Sharon Tate's neck. Hanging a victim or posing a victim with a rope around their neck is a classic mafia warning. It signifies a traitor. It signifies a thief. The Italian syndicates used this exact method in New York and Chicago to humiliate those who stole from the family. By linking Sebring and Tate together with the rope, Watson was not merely inflicting psychological terror. He was completing the specific staging of a gangland execution. Sebring was the primary target, and the rope served as the syndicate's signature. The slaughter. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Panic set in. Folger and Frykowski realized they were not going to be tied up and robbed. They were going to be slaughtered. They fought back. Frykowski struggled with his captors. He broke free. He ran for the front door. Folger broke free and ran down the hallway toward the back of the house. The clean, professional hit devolved into a chaotic butchery. The hit squad chased them down. They caught Frykowski on the front lawn. They shot him, bludgeoned him over the head with the butt of the revolver, and stabbed him 51 times. They caught Folger on the manicured grass near the pool. They stabbed her 28 times. The violence was frantic, messy, and loud, but it achieved the objective. The collateral damage was eliminated. The witnesses were silenced. Back in the living room, Sharon Tate was left alone with the killers. She was tethered to the dead body of her friend. She was surrounded by the metallic smell of blood. The reality of her situation was absolute. She was not going to survive. She begged. She did not beg for her own life. She begged for the life of her unborn child. She asked the killers to take her as a hostage. She offered them 2 weeks. She pleaded with them to just let her give birth, and then they could kill her. Her pleas fell on deaf ears. The killers were not operating on empathy. They were operating on a contract. The mob mandate does not allow for exceptions. The men who governed La Cosa Nostra routinely authorized the executions of their own blood relatives to maintain discipline within the ranks. A pregnant actress held zero leverage against a Cosa Nostra protocol designed to ensure absolute silence. The hit squad, allegedly adhering to strict parameters set by their underworld contacts, could not afford a moment of human hesitation. Leaving a high-profile survivor to testify in a federal court would have guaranteed a lethal reprisal from the commission against the killers themselves. You do not leave a pregnant woman alive to identify you in a police lineup. You do not leave a survivor to talk to the FBI. The killers looked at a desperate mother and saw only a loose end. She was stabbed 16 times. She died calling out for her own mother. Pig. The slaughter was complete. The debt was collected. The drug hub at CieloDrive was permanently shut down. But the most crucial part of the operation was yet to be executed. The cover-up had to be initiated. Before leaving the house, Susan Atkins took a towel. She soaked it in the pooling blood of Sharon Tate. She walked to the heavy wooden front door. She used the blood to write a single word on the white surface. Pig. This single word was the masterpiece of the Mafia's misdirection strategy. It was a calculated reference to the growing racial and political tensions in America. The Black Panthers routinely referred to the police and the establishment as pigs. By writing this word in blood, the killers were actively planting false evidence. They were seeding a narrative. The mob bosses knew the Los Angeles Police Department was already stretched thin dealing with riots and political extremists. They knew the police would walk into the bloodbath at CieloDrive, see the word pig, and immediately assume it was the work of black militants or a crazed anti-establishment cult. The police would look at the bizarre staging and ignore the obvious drug connections. They would chase a political or ideological motive, entirely missing the financial one. The killers walked out of the house. They got back into the car. They drove away into the Los Angeles night. They threw the bloody clothes and the weapons down a ravine. They returned to the Spawn Ranch. The trap was set perfectly. The morning of August 9th. The sun crested the Santa Monica Mountains on the morning of August 9th, 1969, baking the asphalt of Benedict Canyon. At the end of the winding driveway, 150 CieloDrive sat in absolute, deafening silence. The hit squad was gone. The Mafia's debt was settled. The false flag was planted. Now the stage was perfectly set for the greatest law enforcement illusion of the 20th century. Winifred Chapman, the housekeeper, stepped off the bus at the bottom of the hill. She walked up the steep incline, sweating in the morning heat. She expected a normal Saturday. She expected to clean up after a Friday night gathering, to wash glasses, to tidy the living room for a heavily pregnant Sharon Tate. She walked through the front gate. She noticed the severed telephone wires dangling from the pole. She thought it was a careless mistake by a utility worker. She kept walking. She saw the white AMC Rambler parked at an odd angle in the driveway. She walked closer. She looked through the driver's side window. Stephen Parent lay slumped across the front seat. He was covered in blood. He had been shot 4 times. Chapman froze. She looked toward the manicured lawns. She saw a white nightgown stained crimson on the grass. It was Abigail Folger. Further down, near the bushes, lay Wojciech Frykowski. The violence was not contained. It had spilled out of the house and infected the entire estate. Chapman did not go inside. She ran screaming down the driveway, hammering on the doors of neighboring mansions, begging someone to call the police. The police walk into the trap. The Los Angeles Police Department dispatched units from the West Los Angeles Division. Officers Jerry DeRosa and William Weisenhunt were the first to arrive. They drove up the canyon with their sirens echoing off the canyon walls. They parked outside the gate. They drew their service revolvers. They stepped onto the property. They secured the perimeter. They found the bodies on the lawn. They moved toward the main house. They saw the word pig smeared in thick, drying blood on the front door. They kicked the door open and stepped into the living room. The scene inside was a calculated tableau of terror. Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring lay dead on the floor, connected by the nylon rope slung over the ceiling rafter. The officers checked for pulses. There were none. The patrolmen secured the perimeter, established a crime scene log, and waited for homicide detectives. Within an hour, CieloDrive was swarming. Detectives, forensic technicians, and commanding officers flooded the property. The Hollywood division took over. The detectives began their walkthrough. They looked for the standard motives. They looked for robbery. They looked for forced entry. The robbery theory collapsed immediately. Expensive stereo equipment sat untouched in the living room. Sharon Tate's diamond rings were still on her fingers. Jay Sebring's wallet, filled with cash, was still in his pocket. Criminals do not slaughter 5 people and leave the valuables behind unless the violence itself is the objective. The detectives looked at the blood writing. They looked at the rope. They fell perfectly, predictably, into the trap the mafia had laid for them. They immediately suspected black militants. They suspected radical leftist groups. The false flag operated flawlessly. The mob had handed the LAPD a script, and the detectives read their lines without missing a beat. They began profiling a political or cult-driven massacre. What was found? But a crime scene of this magnitude cannot be entirely controlled, even by the most professional hit squad. As the morning wore on, the forensic sweep deepened. Specialized units began tearing the house apart. They searched the bedrooms. They searched the luxury vehicles parked in the driveway. They searched Jay Sebring's black Porsche. The narrative began to fracture. According to leaked accounts and whistleblower testimony from the fringes of the investigation, the search yielded explosive results. The technicians popped the trunk of Sebring's Porsche. They found hidden compartments. Inside those compartments, they allegedly discovered significant quantities of narcotics. They found pristine, tightly wrapped bricks of cocaine. They moved back into the house. They checked the drop ceilings. They pulled back the panels. They found more product. This was not a personal stash. This was not a few grams left over from a Hollywood party. This was distribution weight. The packaging bore the unmistakable signature of the East Coast syndicates. It was pure, uncut, and worth a fortune on the street. The discovery shifted the gravity of the entire crime scene. The sharpest detectives in the room understood immediately what they were looking at. The rope around Sebring's neck was no longer a bizarre cult ritual. It was a gangland necktie. The overkill was no longer a frantic, drug-fueled frenzy. It was a calculated mafia warning. The house was not a sanctuary. It was a high-level narcotics distribution hub that had been liquidated. The Black Book. The cocaine was not the most dangerous thing the police found on CieloDrive that morning. They searched Sebring's personal effects. They found his ledger. It was a small, unassuming black book. In the legitimate world, a hairstylist keeps an appointment book. In Sebring's underworld, he kept a ledger of debts, deliveries, and clients. The names written in that ledger were a roll call of American royalty. It contained the names of untouchable movie stars, men and women who generated millions of dollars for the studio system. It contained the names of legendary directors. It contained the names of studio executives, wealthy financiers, and prominent California politicians. Jay Sebring had not just been supplying the fringes of Hollywood. He had been supplying the core of the establishment. He had been walking pure mafia cocaine into the penthouses of the people who funded political campaigns and controlled the media. For law enforcement, a ledger containing the names of prominent studio executives and politicians linked to a narcotics ring represented a catastrophic jurisdictional liability. If this ledger was logged into official evidence, it would become public record during a trial. The press would get hold of it. The resulting scandal would not just end careers. It would dismantle the entire power structure of Los Angeles. The cover-up. The chain of command was notified. The discovery bypassed the standard homicide sergeants and went directly to the upper echelons of the Los Angeles Police Department. The response from the brass was not a mandate to follow the evidence wherever it led. The response was a mandate to contain the blast radius. The system engaged its defense mechanisms. The LAPD was not a fundamentally corrupt organization from top to bottom, but it was a pragmatic one. It existed to maintain order and protect the status quo of the city's elite. Exposing a massive Cosa Nostra drug ring servicing the biggest stars in the world would cause unprecedented civic and economic chaos. The studios would panic. The politicians would demand heads on pikes. The resulting federal investigations would tear the city apart. A shadow operation was initiated right there on the blood-stained grounds of CieloDrive. Orders came down quiet and absolute. Plainclothes men operating outside the standard forensic hierarchy allegedly took control of the contraband. The kilograms of cocaine were quietly boxed up, removed from the property, and placed into the trunks of unmarked police vehicles. They were never logged into the official property room. They never received an evidence tag. They vanished. Sebring's black book was confiscated. It was handed over to the highest-ranking officers on the scene. It was driven downtown, locked in a secure vault, and effectively buried alive. The names of the elite clients were protected. Their secrets were safe. The crime scene was systematically sanitized of its narcotic reality. The police reconstructed the narrative to fit the false flag. They focused the cameras and the forensic reports entirely on the blood, the rope, and the word pig. They built a wall around the mafia connection and cemented it shut. The detectives on the ground were told to pursue the radical fringe theory. They were directed to look for hippies, drifters, and political extremists. Any officer who questioned the missing drugs or the nature of Sebring's business was quickly reassigned or silenced with the threat of professional ruin. By the time the bodies were wheeled out of the estate and loaded into the coroner's vans, the truth had already been murdered alongside them. The mob had executed the hit perfectly, but it was the Los Angeles establishment that executed the cover-up. The scared city. The media explosion that followed the discovery at CieloDrive was immediate and completely unprecedented. Los Angeles was a city built on the manufacturing of illusions, but it had never produced a script this dark. By Sunday morning, the headlines across the country screamed of ritual slaughter, blood-soaked mansions, and Hollywood royalty butchered in the hills. The news networks broadcast images of the estate gates. They showed the coroner's vans rolling down the canyon. They repeated the word written in blood on the front door. The press did not report a targeted assassination. They reported a random, chaotic rampage. They printed hysteria. This hysteria was exactly what the Los Angeles Police Department and the shadow operators of the underworld needed. Panic gripped the Hollywood elite. Gun sales in Beverly Hills skyrocketed. Guard dogs were sold out within hours. Security firms could not hire men fast enough. Movie stars locked themselves inside their estates, terrified that a roving band of psychotic hippies was coming for them next. But a quiet parallel panic was unfolding in the private offices and locked boardrooms of the entertainment industry. The most powerful people in the city were not afraid of Charles Manson. They did not even know who he was yet. They were afraid because Jay Sebring was dead. They knew exactly what Sebring did for a living. They knew about the black bags he carried into their homes. They knew the East Coast syndicate supplied him. When news of his brutal execution broke, the elite clientele realized the mafia was auditing its West Coast operations. They waited for the police to come knocking. The knock never came. The LAPD had already sanitized the crime scene. The cocaine was gone. The black ledger was buried deep in a vault. The detectives on television did not mention narcotics. They did not mention organized crime. They talked about hippies. They talked about radical fringe groups. The Hollywood elite breathed a collective sigh of relief. The police had chosen to protect the establishment. Helter-skelter. As Los Angeles plunged into a state of collective mourning, the architects of her death quietly monitored the broadcasts. Independent researchers argue that the capos of La Cosa Nostra viewed the massive public outpouring of grief not as a tragedy, but as highly effective camouflage. The media's relentless focus on the fear of a counterculture uprising provided an impenetrable smokescreen. With the drug angle successfully suppressed, law enforcement needed a villain to fit the bloody, theatrical staging of the crime scene. They found their perfect scapegoat living in the dirt and squalor of the San Fernando Valley. Charles Manson was 34 years old in the summer of 1969. He had spent more than half of his life inside federal penitentiaries and reformatories. He was a petty car thief, a forger, and a pimp. He was institutionalized, uneducated, and desperate for fame. The official narrative elevated Manson to the status of a dark, hypnotic genius. It claimed he possessed a mystical ability to brainwash his followers. The reality of Charles Manson was incredibly banal. He was not a sorcerer. He was a predator who preyed on the weakest members of society. He used basic street-level pimp psychology to control vulnerable young women. He fed them drugs, stripped them of their identities, and used them as currency to buy favor with minor players in the music industry. He was a hustler looking for a record deal. Manson interacted with the fringes of the Hollywood drug trade. He supplied women and cheap narcotics to musicians and low-level producers. This proximity to the underworld is where the fatal connection was forged. Manson owed money. He was always looking for a score. The mafia operators, looking for a disposable asset to handle the Sebring problem, saw a loud, erratic ex-convict leading a group of heavily armed, drug-addicted youths. They saw the perfect weapon. They gave Manson the contract. The LAPD raided the Spahn Ranch a week later. They did not raid it for the Tate murders. They raided it for a stolen Volkswagen ring. The contrast between the pristine wealth of CieloDrive and the absolute filth of the Spahn Ranch was staggering. The deputies found garbage, stolen car parts, and heavily armed transients. They arrested Manson and his followers on auto theft charges. While Manson sat in a jail cell, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office faced a monumental task. They had the killers. Fingerprints and informants eventually tied Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Manson to the murders. But they had a massive problem. They had no motive. A jury requires a motive. The prosecution could not introduce the truth. They could not stand up in a courtroom and explain that Sebring was a mafia cocaine distributor and Tate was collateral damage in a mob hit. That would expose the police cover-up. It would expose the Hollywood elite. It would unravel the entire corrupt fabric of the city. Vincent Bugliosi constructed a masterpiece of legal fiction. He built the helter-skelter theory. Bugliosi looked at Manson's obsession with the Beatles. He looked at the word pig written in blood. He interviewed the brainwashed girls. He wove these disparate threads into a terrifying, cohesive narrative. He argued that Manson believed a global race war was imminent. He argued that Manson ordered the killings to frame the Black Panthers and ignite an apocalyptic conflict. He claimed Manson believed he and his followers would hide in a bottomless pit in the desert and emerge to rule the world after the war destroyed civilization. It was utterly absurd. It was also brilliant. The helter-skelter theory was the ultimate gift to the establishment. It was a self-contained narrative. It required no further investigation into the victim's finances. It required no subpoenas of Hollywood executives. It required no wiretaps of Italian crime families in New York. It laid the entire blame at the feet of a dirty, rambling madman and his cult of acid casualties. The media devoured it. Manson realized exactly what was happening, and he leaned into it. He was a lifelong loser who had finally achieved the fame he craved. The Mafia had handed him the front page of every newspaper in the world. He played his part flawlessly. He grew his hair wild. He carved an X into his forehead, later modifying it into a swastika. He ranted in the courtroom. He lunged at the judge. He gave bizarre, cryptic interviews to television reporters. He acted exactly like the demonic cult leader the prosecution needed him to be. He was the ultimate useful idiot. The trial was a circus. The girls shaved their heads. They sang songs in the corridors of the courthouse. They showed no remorse. They solidified the myth of the brainwashed family. The jury watched the spectacle and believed every word of Bugliosi's theory. The prosecution presented the bloody clothes. They presented the weapons. They presented the testimony of Linda Kasabian. They never presented the black ledger. They never presented the kilos of cocaine from the Porsche. The operation was a complete success. The West Coast pipeline was temporarily disrupted, but the debt was definitively settled. The rogue distributor was dead. The warning was broadcast loud and clear to the rest of the network, and the police had willingly, enthusiastically buried the truth to protect their own city. The theft of Sharon Tate. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Manson and his followers were found guilty of first-degree murder. They were sentenced to death, later commuted to life in prison when California briefly abolished the death penalty. The justice system patted itself on the back. The politicians declared that the monsters had been slain. The city of Los Angeles went back to sleep, secure in the lie that the evil had been purged from the desert. But the victims were left behind in the cold machinery of this false narrative. Sharon Tate's legacy was hijacked. She was reduced to a prop in a horror movie. Her memory was forever chained to the raving lunatic with a swastika on his forehead. The world forgot about her talent. They forgot about the life she was carrying. They only remembered the way she died. She was robbed of her life by a hit squad, and she was robbed of her truth by the justice system. The true perpetrators, the men in the tailored suits who ordered the hit, walked away into the shadows, leaving Charles Manson to serve as their permanent, smiling decoy. The unseen executives of La Cosa Nostra who authorized the liquidation lived out their natural lives in opulent security. They had the privilege of growing old and legitimizing their wealth, the very same fundamental human experiences they violently denied Tate. While her memory remains tragically frozen in the violence of 1969, forever bound to a fabricated cult myth, the true architects within the Cosa Nostra faded into comfortable obscurity, entirely untouched by the law. The East Coast crime families did not miss a single beat. The disruption to their West Coast distribution network was temporary. They replaced Jay Sebring before his blood had even dried on the living room floor. The cocaine continued to flow into the canyons, the studios, and the private clubs of Beverly Hills. The Hollywood elite, the very people who had funded Sebring's illicit empire, found new suppliers. They attended the heavily publicized funerals. They wept for the cameras. They gave interviews about the tragedy of a lost generation. And then they returned to their mansions and snorted lines of pure mafia product off mirrored tables. The hypocrisy was as absolute as it was invisible. The most profound tragedy of the official narrative is the systematic erasure of Sharon Tate's humanity. Before the night of August 8th, 1969, she was a woman possessing immense potential, a rising star navigating a complex industry, and a mother eagerly awaiting the birth of her son, Paul Richard Polanski. After that night, she ceased to be a person. She was transformed into a symbol. She became the ultimate victim, a prop in a true crime horror story. Her legacy was hijacked by the very men who orchestrated her slaughter. Her name became permanently tethered to Charles Manson. The mafia did not just take her life. The ensuing cover-up took her identity. The detectives who had allegedly boxed up the cocaine and buried the black ledger retired with full pensions. They took their secrets to the grave. They justified their actions as a necessary evil, a pragmatic decision to protect the city's economic engine from a catastrophic scandal. They convinced themselves that putting a dangerous predator like Manson behind bars justified the fabrication of his motive. They believed they were protecting the innocent. In reality, they were functioning as accessories after the fact for the Cosa Nostra. They allowed the most powerful organized crime syndicate in the country to execute a hit on American soil and walk away without a single question being asked. An objective analysis of the crime scene presents elements that contradict the narrative of a disorganized, drug-fueled attack. The forensic evidence of victims severely beaten and bound by a nylon rope, alongside specific messaging left at the scene, bears the hallmarks of a highly structured, calculated operation. For some investigators, these tactics closely mirror the precise methods of an organized crime execution rather than a random cult rampage. Jay Sebring played a dangerous game. He operated as a high-wire act between the glamorous light of Hollywood and the brutal dark of the underworld. He gambled with millions of dollars of mob money, and he lost. He paid for that failure with his life. But Sharon Tate was not a participant in that trade. She was not a gangster. She was not a distributor. She was simply a woman sitting in her own living room, seeking comfort in the final weeks of her pregnancy. She was killed for the simple, horrific reason that she was in the room when the collectors arrived. She was collateral damage in a corporate dispute fought with knives and revolvers. As the decades passed, the true story of CieloDrive was relegated to the fringes of conspiracy theory. Whenever an independent investigator or retired whistleblower attempted to bring up the missing narcotics or Sebring's mafia connections, they were immediately discredited. The establishment protected its investment in the helter-skelter myth. The narrative was too profitable to abandon. It spawned an entire industry of books, documentaries, and movies. Charles Manson became a morbid celebrity. He received thousands of letters in prison. He gave television interviews. He played the role of the demonic guru to perfection right up until his death in a prison hospital in 2017. He died a famous man. The mob bosses who actually ordered the hit died of old age in their luxury estates, surrounded by their families, their wealth entirely intact. The helter-skelter narrative successfully imprisoned Manson and calmed a terrified public. Yet, for independent researchers, the official story serves as a convenient shield. It permanently obscured the complex, potentially lucrative criminal ties surrounding CieloDrive and allowed a sprawling narcotics network to remain in the shadows. Ultimately, it reduced Sharon Tate's legacy and the tragic loss of her life to a mere footnote in a manufactured horror story. The iron doors of the California state prison system slammed shut on Charles Manson and his followers, locking them away for the rest of their natural lives. The American public exhaled a collective sigh of relief. The boogeyman was in a cage. The streets of Los Angeles were supposedly safe again. The politicians held press conferences, the prosecutors wrote best-selling books, and the justice system declared a total victory over the forces of anarchy. It was the neat cinematic ending that Hollywood demanded. It was also the final necessary component of the cover-up. With Manson safely behind bars and the helter-skelter narrative universally accepted as gospel, the true architects of the CieloDrive massacre vanished completely into the background noise of the 1970s. The most profound tragedy of this narrative is the permanent theft of Sharon Tate's humanity. She was not a symbol. She was not a headline. She was not a prop in someone else's myth. She was a woman carrying a child, sitting inside a house that had been marked for liquidation by men in the shadows. She was killed because she was there when the debt came due. And then the system turned around and buried the truth right beside her. This has been Sharon Tate, CieloDrive, the Cosa Nostra, and the Cover-Up, a Pizzaverse Studios documentary. A Palermo Productions original. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent DiPrio. If you want more stories about the blood beneath the glamour, the money beneath the myth, and the hidden machinery behind Hollywood history, stay with the Pizzaverse. Because the official story is usually the cleanest lie in the room. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting the channel. And thank you for being here while these stories are stripped down piece by piece. For every polished legend, every theatrical boogeyman, and every innocent life buried beneath a manufactured narrative, there is always value in dragging the darker truth into the light. Sharon Tate. J. Sebring. Charles Manson.
Black. 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 Black.
The lovely ladies around the pool. There again is Sharon Tate. And did you know the Bill Trevilla won his Academy Award for designing clothes not for a woman, but for an Errol Flynn picture? We're talking to Miss Sharon Tate, and we're aboard the Princess Italia after the premiere of Valley of the Dolls. And may we offer our congratulations. I guess this is your first major dramatic role. The part calls for someone who is beautiful as well as talented, and the beauty is required because of several of the scenes, and I hesitate to mention what they are, but they are very daring. Can you tell us how one gets in the mood to do something as daring as the disrobing you do in the film? There, I said it.
Well, I don't think there's any mood. I think if you try to prepare yourself, you fall flat on your face.
Face?
Yeah. Actually, it's very good, you know, because it's something so difficult to do. And I found that if you forget more what you're doing, you know, and try not to be so self-conscious about things that are so normal, people don't notice you as much as if you're, you know, trying to be so shy about everything.
Well, I guarantee you will be noticed by this scene as well as others. And talking about scenes in which you'll be noticed, there's a very tender scene with you and Tony Scotti, and I think we'd like to show that to our audience now, and also know that they'll want to see the rest of the film and your performance. And we thank you so very much, and congratulations to you, Miss Sharon Tate.
Thank you.
And now we'll take a look at this scene from Valley of the Dolls.
After you knew what that had happened at Sharon Tate's, the most brutal murder that people were aware of. Not that there's not a lot of other brutality around, but this got attention. What'd you think?
Well, I looked over in Vietnam and I said...
No, what'd you think about Sharon Tate and her unborn baby?
What did I think about it?
Yeah.
It's not my world. I don't live in that world.
Well, so you didn't care?
Care?
Suppose
What the
technically...
hell does that mean, care?
Well, it means love. That means some
Put
sense
me
of...
in solitary confinement, break my teeth out, break my ribs, bust me up, kick me down a hole,
Right.
and then come back and tell me about care. I don't know what care is, man.